The gold cufflinks had belonged to Cora. Walter Eugene Moss stood at the bathroom mirror of the house on Sycamore Road and held them in his palm for a moment before pushing them through the starched cuffs of his ivory dress shirt. They were small and oval, engraved with a simple letter M on each face, and Cora had pressed them into his hand the morning of their 40th anniversary with a look that required no words at all. She had been gone 4 years now, and Walter wore them only on days when he needed to feel that she was still paying attention. Today was that kind of day. He turned and studied himself in the full-length mirror on the back of the bedroom door. Charcoal slacks pressed the night before with deliberate patience, the crease so sharp it could have ruled a line. The ivory shirt buttoned to the collar. A tie he'd selected and then removed Sunday was not a tie day, even for important errands, then a dark olive sport coat instead. Understated. Correct. The bedroom smelled of cedar from the closet, and the faint trace of Cora's perfume that still lived in the dresser scarves she had embroidered, though Walter had never been able to explain how that scent persisted so many years after she was gone. Maybe he only imagined it. Maybe some things stayed because you needed them to. He'd long since stopped trying to understand the physics of grief. He sat on the edge of the bed to tie his shoes, black Oxfords polished to a low shine, and the familiar ache moved through his right hip the way it always did in the morning. The doctors called it degenerative. Walter called it the price of spending 26 years on a concrete floor in the machine shop before he bought into the parts distribution company with his brother-in-law Raymond. The company had done well. Better than well. The house on Sycamore Road was paid off in full 11 years ago, and Walter had kept every receipt, every record, every document that proved it. He was not a man who left things to memory when paper would do. He descended the stairs carefully, one hand on the rail, and went to the kitchen where his coffee was already brewed on the timer Cora had set back in 2018 and which Walter had never changed. He stood at the counter and drank it black and read the letter one more time, though he had nearly memorized it. The letter was from the Millbrook County Office of Records and Assessment, and it informed Walter Eugene Moss that a lien had been placed on the property located at 114 Sycamore Road in the amount of $47,200 attached by virtue of an unresolved contractor dispute pursuant to Millbrook County Code Section 14.2.771. The lien had a claimant, Whitmore Development and Construction, LLC. Walter had never hired Whitmore Development and Construction, LLC. He had never spoken to them, signed anything with them, or received services from them. He had, however, noticed in the past year that Whitmore had been aggressively acquiring properties on the east side of Millbrook, the side where the black families had lived for 3 generations, where the houses were older and the lots larger, and where the county's redevelopment rezoning had recently extended. He was not naive. He was 71 years old, and he had lived his entire life in Millbrook County, Virginia, and he understood exactly what a phantom lien from a development company was designed to accomplish. To cloud a title, create legal uncertainty, pressure an elderly homeowner to sell rather than fight. He had seen it done to 2 of his neighbors in the past 18 months. Amos Jefferson on the next block had sold his house of 40 years for what Walter estimated was $60,000 below market, exhausted by paperwork and the feeling of invisible walls closing in. Dorothy Watkins had fought hers and won. But Dorothy's daughter was a contract attorney in Richmond who came home for 6 weekends straight to manage the process. Walter did not have a daughter in Richmond. He had Marcus. And Marcus had told him last month, sitting at this same kitchen table over the pot roast Walter still made from Cora's recipe, "Dad, document everything, everything. If they approach you, if they file anything, if anyone shows up, document it, photograph it, and call me. Don't try to resolve anything yourself. Promise me." Walter had promised. He was a man who kept his promises. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. He picked up his leather satchel, old brown with a buckle that had been repaired once, and verified its contents for the 3rd time, the original deed to the property, notarized and dated 1983. The title, insurance policy. The payoff letter from the mortgage company stamped and signed, dated September 14th, 2013. The full payment history, 11 years of property tax receipts, each one carefully hole-punched and filed in chronological order. Photographs of the property timestamped with GPS metadata intact. The county assessor's records showing Walter's ownership unencumbered. The certified letter he had sent to Whitmore Development, disputing the lien with the return receipt card signed and dated proving delivery. He had also printed the relevant sections of Millbrook County Code Section 14.2.771 with the burden of proof provisions highlighted. He had prepared a one-page summary document that laid out the timeline of the filing, the dispute, and the request for administrative review. It was organized the way a good machine operation was organized, every component in its place, every step sequenced, nothing left to improvise. He locked the front door, tested it twice, and walked to his car. A 2016 Buick LeSabre in dark burgundy, kept clean and serviced on schedule. He backed out of the driveway and paused for a moment, looking at the house from the street, as he sometimes did. His father, George Moss, had poured the foundation of that house with 2 other men and a rented mixer in the summer of 1961. The county had not made it easy. The permits had been delayed twice for reasons that were never clearly explained, and the contractor George had hired had backed out after receiving what he described only as a visit. George Moss had found other men and done most of the work himself on weekends after his shifts at the textile mill. He had finished the house in November of that year and moved his wife and 3 children in before the first frost. George Moss had told Walter that story exactly once when Walter was 12 years old, standing in the front yard after mowing the lawn. He said it the way a man says something that is too large for repetition, once straight without decoration. "The house is ours. We built it. Remember that." Walter put the car in drive. He remembered. The Millbrook County Courthouse occupied the northeast corner of the town square, a 2-story building in red brick, with white columns and a set of wide marble steps that had been worn smooth in the center by decades of foot traffic. On Sundays, the recorder's office opened for 2 hours between 9 and 11 to accommodate residents who worked weekdays and could not otherwise access county services. Walter had scheduled his appointment for 10 o'clock. He arrived at 9:40. The town square was quiet in the way that county seats are quiet on Sunday mornings, the kind of quiet that happens when a space built for weekday activity settles into itself, breathing differently. A small farmer's market operated along the west side of the square, maybe 20 stalls selling early-season vegetables, flowers, preserves, and handmade items. The vendors were setting up when Walter arrived, the sound of folding tables and canvas awnings and cheerful greetings carrying in the still air. Walter, parked on the street, fed the meter. It was a Sunday, and the meters were optional. But Walter fed them anyway, always because he had learned a long time ago that the smallest technicalities could be made large by the wrong kind of attention, and walked toward the courthouse steps. His hip was stiff from the drive, and he moved at the pace of a man who had learned to accommodate pain without advertising it. He reached the courthouse plaza, which was paved in old brick between concrete planters, and saw a wood and iron bench near the bottom of the steps. He sat. He was not loitering. He was early, and the offices would not be open for another 15 minutes, and his hip needed the rest. He set his satchel on the bench beside him and watched the farmers' market stalls take shape and breathed the morning air, which smelled of wet grass and early spring cold, and thought about his father pouring concrete in the summer of 1961. He had been sitting for perhaps 8 minutes when Officer Dale Pruitt noticed him. Walter saw the officer across the plaza, standing near the corner entrance of the courthouse with a younger partner, coffee cup in hand, and he recognized the particular quality of attention. Immediately, the way a man's body shifts from general observation to specific focus. A subtle realignment of stance, a stillness that is the opposite of casual. Walter had seen it aimed at him before more times than he could count in grocery stores and parking lots and bank lobbies and highway shoulders, and he recognized it the way you recognize the sound of a specific dog in the neighborhood. No need to look for the source once you know the voice. He did not change his posture. He did not look away. He sat straight, satchel beside him, and waited for what was coming. In the same way you wait for a weather front, you saw a building on the horizon an hour ago. Not with fear, not with surprise. but with the weary accuracy of long experience. Dale Pruitt was 38 years old and had been with Millbrook County PD for 11 years. He was 6 feet and change broad through the shoulders, with the kind of confidence that comes not from competence, but from never having been seriously challenged. He wore his uniform the way some men wear a second skin, not as clothing, but as a statement about the hierarchy of a given space. He walked toward Walter with the unhurried authority of a man who had already decided the outcome of the conversation before it began. His partner, Deputy Kyle Stearns, followed 2 steps behind. Stearns was 29 and had the look of a man who was not sure yet how he felt about things, which was in its own way the most dangerous kind of witness, too uncertain to intervene, too observant to fully ignore. Pruitt stopped in front of Walter and hooked his thumb in his belt. "You got business here." Walter looked up. He had already arranged his face into the expression he had been perfecting since he was roughly 16 years old. Attentive, non-threatening patient in a way that communicated dignity without suggesting challenge. It was not a smile. It was something more careful than that. "Good morning, officer. I have an appointment with the recorder's office at 10 o'clock. I'm a few minutes early." Pruitt looked at the satchel. "What's in the bag?" "Documentation for a county matter I'm contesting. I have an appointment confirmation if you'd like to see it." "What kind of documentation?" "Property records. A lien dispute." Pruitt's expression didn't change. "You got ID?" "Of course." Walter reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and produced his wallet, extracted his Virginia driver's license with practiced ease, and held it out. He had placed it in the front slot that morning because he had known with the quiet certainty of 7 decades that this moment was likely. Not this exact moment, not this exact officer, but this moment in general. He had been carrying his license accessible and ready since he was 23 years old. Pruitt took the license, held it close, read it again. His eyes moved to Walter, back to the license. "This your current address?" "Yes, sir." "How long you been in Millbrook County?" "I was born here. I've lived at that address for 34 years. Pruitt did not respond to this. He turned the license over, looked at the back, which told him nothing, and then held it in his hand in a way that made clear he had no immediate intention of returning it. "I'm going to hold on to this while I verify your appointment." Walter kept his voice level. He had been speaking to officers like Pruitt since long before Pruitt was born, and he knew the grammar of these interactions the way a musician knows a key signature. "Officer, I'll need that license to check in with the clerk's office. They require identification." "I decide what you need." Pruitt stepped slightly closer. "Not close enough to be technically aggressive. Close enough to be understood. You'll get it back when I'm satisfied. Sit down." Walter was already sitting. He did not point this out. Stearns stood slightly to the side and said nothing. He was looking at something in the middle distance, the way people look at things they have decided not to see. Across the plaza, out of the flower stall nearest the courtyard entrance, a woman in a yellow apron was arranging buckets of tulips and early roses and watching the interaction without appearing to watch it. Her name was Maria Gonzalez, and she had been selling flowers at this market for 6 years, and she had seen this particular exchange before, not these specific people, but this specific dynamic more times than she wished. She reached beneath her counter and turned on her phone's camera and propped it at an angle against a bucket of sunflowers and continued arranging her flowers with both hands. Walter Moss reached into the front pocket of his sport coat and started his voice memo app. He had promised Marcus he would document everything. He intended to keep that promise. Pruitt made the radio call from where he stood, which Walter understood was deliberate, the performance of due diligence conducted in full view loudly enough for nearby ears. "Dispatch running an ID check." White male. He caught himself, looked at Walter, started again. "Running an ID check." Black male, approximately 70 years old. Name Walter Eugene Moss. He read the license number. Location Courthouse Plaza, Millbrook County main entrance. Checking for warrants and verification of court business. The use of court business was interesting. Walter had not said he was coming for court business. He had said the recorder's office. The distinction was minor and probably meaningless, except that Pruitt had chosen to inflate it, which suggested that Pruitt was not particularly concerned with accuracy. Walter sat with his hands in his lap and breathed carefully and did not speak. He was thinking about Marcus. Not about his son, as he was now deputy director of the FBI's National Security Division, 43 years old and formidably capable, and the kind of man that rooms reorganized themselves around when he walked in. He was thinking about Marcus, at 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and the afternoon a police car had pulled into the driveway because a neighbor had reported a suspicious individual in the yard, which had been Marcus raking leaves for the $2 a week Walter paid him as an allowance. 2 officers had knocked on the door. Walter had answered. The conversation had been brief and without incident, and afterward Marcus had come to Walter's chair in the living room and stood there for a moment, 9 years old and processing something before asking Dad why did they come. Walter had told the truth, as much of it as a 9-year-old could hold. He had said, because some people see the color of your skin before they see anything else about you. That's something you're going to have to know how to navigate. And Marcus had looked at him and said with a precision that was so adult and so heartbreaking that Walter had replayed it in his mind hundreds of times, since navigate means go around. I don't want to go around. Walter had not had a good answer for that then. He still didn't. Dispatch crackled back. No warrants, clean record. Pruitt was informed that the recorder's office did have a scheduled appointment for a Walter Moss at 10 a.m. He did not return the license. You'll wait here until I confirm with the office directly. Of course, officer. Pruitt walked back toward the courthouse entrance, nodding at Stearns to hold position. Stearns looked at Walter briefly, something unreadable crossing his face, not hostility, not quite sympathy, something in between, which in practice meant nothing, and then looked away again. The farmer's market was fully active now. The smell of coffee from a nearby stall moved through the plaza on the light morning breeze. A man with 2 young children walked past, the children's hands full of sugar snap peas they'd gotten as samples from a vegetable vendor, their faces sticky and unconcerned with anything. A couple walked their dog along the perimeter of the plaza, the dog straining at the leash toward a planter. Normal Sunday morning mechanics, the world going about its business in the sunlight, while Walter Moss sat on a bench with his license in someone else's pocket. He shifted, trying to ease his hip. The bench was wood, and the morning was still cold enough that the wood had held the overnight chill, and the cold moved into the joint, the way cold does when joints are old and acquainted with it. He would not stand, not while Stearns was watching, because standing might be interpreted as attempting to leave, and he was not willing to give anyone a pretext of any kind. Instead, he looked at the farmer's market and counted the stalls, 18 visible from here, and noted which vendors had cameras on their setups and which ones did not. He noted the teenager sitting on the low wall near the market entrance with a phone in his hand, earbuds, in apparently scrolling, who had glanced up at the interaction with Pruitt twice in the past 5 minutes, and who was Walter suspected not quite as absorbed in his screen as he appeared. The boy was maybe 16, 17, lean in a basketball jersey, and there was something watchful in the way he held himself that Walter recognized as a particular kind of vigilance, the kind you develop when you've learned that things can change fast and you need to be able to say exactly what happened. Walter had taught Marcus that vigilance. It had cost him something to teach it, because the teaching acknowledged a reality he had wanted his son to be able to deny. But the teaching may well have been the most important thing he'd ever given him. Pruitt returned from the courthouse entrance and stopped in front of Walter without preamble. Office confirmed your appointment, but I'm still not satisfied with your presence out here prior to the office opening. You're creating a public disturbance. Walter looked at him steadily. There was no disturbance. The plaza was quiet. Several people had glanced over during the radio exchange, but most had moved on. Calling this a public disturbance was either a misunderstanding of the phrase or a deliberate redefinition of it, and Pruitt did not look like a man prone to misunderstandings about language when the alternative interpretation served his purposes. I arrived early for my appointment and sat on a public bench to rest my hip while I waited, officer. I'm not sure what disturbance you're referring to. Your tone is a disturbance. Walter said nothing to this. There was nothing to say to this. Pruitt stepped closer. I'm going to need you to open that bag. On what grounds? The question was reasonable. It was also, Walter knew, an escalation, not because asking for grounds was unreasonable, but because Pruitt was a man who had been accustomed to compliance without question. and the requirement to articulate grounds was experienced by him as a challenge rather than a right. Walter had asked it anyway, because he had the right to ask it, and because his voice memo was running, and because someone had to say the right things in the right order for the record. Pruitt's jaw tightened. I have reasonable suspicion. Of what specifically? Of whatever I say is specific, old man. He reached down and put his hand on the satchel. Officer, please don't touch my property without... Pruitt yanked the satchel. It didn't come free. The strap was around Walter's wrist, and the yank pulled Walter's arm, and Walter started to lean forward with the pull. And that was when Pruitt's open hand came up and swung out in a fast, flat arc. The sound of the slap crossed the plaza like a crack of split wood. Walter's head snapped to the right. The world went briefly white, then resolved into shapes and gradients without sharp edges because his glasses had come off his face and skittered 4 feet across the brick. He was aware of his hearing aid, the one in his right ear, the one he'd had calibrated just 3 weeks ago, dislodging from the impact and hitting the bricks somewhere to his right, and then the world went asymmetrical. Full sound on his left, a cotton-muffled murmur on his right. His lip had split where it caught his lower tooth, and he tasted copper. He did not fall. He had one hand braced on the bench, and he kept himself upright because he was a man who had spent 71 years practicing not falling. He heard as if from a distance someone say, "Oh, damn," a woman's voice nearby. He heard Pruitt say something, words he couldn't fully make out through the muffled ear and the ringing that had started in his skull. He felt the satchel strap pulled free from his wrist, felt the satchel hit the bricks and tip over, heard the sound of papers spilling. He sat very still for a moment, hand on his jaw, and breathed. The rage was there. It was always there, a specific frequency of burning that Walter had learned to recognize and acknowledge and contain. It was not that he didn't feel it. It was that he had understood at some point in his 40s, after several experiences, not entirely unlike this one, that rage without architecture was just pain with better theater. The rage was information. The rage told him, this is real, this matters, you are not wrong to feel this. But it could not be the driver. Not here. Not now. He thought, I am 71 years old, and my hearing aid is somewhere on these bricks, and my glasses are 4 feet away, and my lip is bleeding. And there are people watching, and my voice memo is running. He thought there are witnesses. He thought Marcus is 40 minutes away. He looked at the bricks in front of him, slightly blurred without his glasses, and found the angular shape of his hearing aid approximately 3 feet to his right, near the base of a concrete planter. He did not move to retrieve it. Pruitt was still speaking a low, controlled rush of words that Walter caught partially reaching without permission. Assault on an officer. Hands where I can see. Walter said clearly and quietly, for the record, I did not assault anyone. I asked you not to touch my property. Pruitt grabbed his shoulder and stood him up, not gently. And Walter was upright. And then Pruitt's hands were on his wrists, and there was the sound of a zip tie, not cuffs. A plastic zip tie, the kind you use to bind packages, tightened to discomfort, and Walter's hands were secured in front of him. Maria Gonzalez, at her flower stall, had stopped pretending to arrange flowers. Her phone was level on the bucket recording. She was not looking at the screen. She was looking at the steps with the expression of someone who is taking in something they intend to carry for a long time. Marcus Webb, the 17-year-old on the low wall, had his phone up now, openly not pretending to scroll. He was filming with the focused stillness of someone who understood that this was documentation, not entertainment. He had turned on his second phone, which he kept for moments like this, a habit his mother had started when he was 12, and which had never until this moment felt so immediately relevant. Harriet Coleman, 67. A retired social studies teacher who had been walking to the vegetable stall stopped at the edge of the plaza. She looked at Walter Moss on the courthouse steps, with his hands zip-tied, blood on his lip glasses on the bricks. She recognized him from the community board meetings she attended every third Thursday. She knew his name. She knew his family. She knew he was one of the kindest, most careful, most precise and meticulous men in Millbrook County. She reached into her purse, found her phone, and began recording without any instruction or prompting from anyone at all, because some things you don't need to be told to record. Some things announce themselves. Pruitt stood over Walter, hand on his shoulder. You're being detained for resisting an officer and creating a public disturbance. You'll wait here until I figure out what we're doing with you. I would like to contact my attorney, Walter said. You can contact whoever you want after I'm done with you. He walked away and left Walter sitting on the steps with his wrists bound, his glasses on the bricks, his hearing aid somewhere in the shadow of the planter, his satchel overturned, and his documents scattered across the courthouse steps in the Sunday morning breeze. Some of the documents had blown down to the lower landing. One had caught against the base of the column and flapped slightly in the air. It was on thick cream paper with a dark embossed seal at the top. The kind of paper that costs more per sheet than most paper costs per ream. The embossed seal was partially obscured by the way the paper had folded, but 3 words were legible from the step above it: Federal Bureau of Investigation. Stearns looked at the document, looked away, picked up 2 nearby papers at random, and placed them in the satchel upside down and out of order, which would have horrified Walter if Walter had been watching. He was not watching. He was looking at a point in the middle distance and doing the kind of breathing that keeps a man's hands still. Walter had done this before. He had been doing this for 55 years. He was very good at it, and he was also in the practiced and methodical way that a man does when he has had sufficient time to prepare extremely angry in a direction that had nothing to do with right now. 40 minutes, he thought, give or take. He had sent the text before he sat down on the bench, before Pruitt even crossed the plaza. Because Walter Moss had arrived early, not just for the appointment, but because he had known with the unhappy certainty of a man who has lived in this town and this body and this skin for 71 years that there was a significant chance he would need someone to know exactly where he was. The text had read, "Bench outside. Don't rush, document everything first." He did not look at the parking lot. He looked at the farmer's market. He breathed. He waited. He was also thinking about a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was 14 and came home from school in the specific way that meant something had happened. Not hurt, not visibly upset, but walking with a controlled economy that was itself a signal, a tightening that Walter recognized because he had learned the same tightening himself at roughly the same age. He had set down his book and waited. Marcus had stood in the doorway of the living room and said, "A cop stopped me on the way home. Said I looked like someone they were looking for. I didn't. I knew I didn't." Walter had said, "What did you do?" "I stayed calm. I showed my ID. I waited until he said I could go." "Good, Dad." Marcus had looked at him with the 14-year-old's specific combination of knowing and needing to know more. "Why do I have to be good? Why do I have to be the one who stays calm?" Walter had felt the full weight of the answer. Because the alternative is worse. Because the world is not fair. Because your calm is the thing that keeps you safe. Because I have spent my entire adult life calculating how much dignity I can hold on to without sacrificing enough safety to come home, and I am going to teach you to do the same calculation. And I am sorry. I am so sorry that this is the thing I have to teach you. He had said because being good is how we get through, and because you being good is not the same as the situation being right. Those are 2 separate things. Don't let anyone confuse them. Marcus had gone upstairs to do his homework, and Walter had sat in his chair for 20 minutes without picking up his book, turning that distinction over the separation between behavioral compliance and moral acceptance of the conditions requiring that compliance. He had wondered whether it was enough to teach his son the difference, or whether teaching the difference was its own kind of complicity. 29 years later, he was still not sure. But Marcus had clearly understood both halves had spent 29 years holding both of them, and the man who would drive 40 miles in a college shirt and find a hearing aid in the landscaping before he announced himself was the direct descendant of the boy who had said, "I don't want to go around." Some things you teach by accident, some you teach on purpose. The line between them is blurrier than any parent wants to admit. The next 90 minutes were a study in institutional theater. Pruitt did not process Walter. He did not file paperwork. He did not transport him anywhere. He did not charge him formally with anything. What he did was the oldest and most effective form of extra-legal punishment available to a man in his position. He made Walter wait. Sitting on the courthouse steps, wrists bound, lips split in full view of the farmer's market and anyone else who happened past, while Pruitt moved back and forth between his cruiser and the courthouse entrance, with the air of a man managing a complex situation, rather than a man who had assaulted an elderly civilian and now had no clear path forward. Walter sat. His hip ached in a low, grinding way that was becoming harder to breathe through. The morning air was warming slightly, but the marble of the steps held the cold, and the cold hadshish-ha moved through his slacks. He kept his back straight. He would not slump. He had never slumped under observation, and he was not going to begin at 71. He watched with the portion of his attention he could spare from managing his body's discomfort, the ongoing documentation forming around him, like a net being quietly cast. Marcus Webb was still filming from the low wall, and he had been joined by 3 other teenagers, all of whom were recording from slightly different angles. They had not coordinated this exactly. It had happened the way these things happen, when young people who have grown up documenting their own lives recognize a situation that needs to be documented, and they simply oriented themselves appropriately and started their cameras. Pruitt had glared at them once, and Marcus Webb had taken one deliberate, visible step backward to establish that he was not in Pruitt's operational space, and then continued filming without any change in expression. Maria Gonzalez had sent a quiet message from behind her flower stall to her cousin, who ran the vegetable stand 3 stalls down, and the cousin had shifted his setup slightly, so his stall camera, the one he used to catch shoplifters, connected to a cloud storage account. He'd set up with his daughter's help, had a clear line to the courthouse steps. He didn't say anything about this to anyone. He just adjusted his canopy pole 6 inches and went back to arranging tomatoes. Harriet Coleman had made a phone call. The call was to her nephew, who worked for the county government in an administrative capacity. And who would know the right people to call? She was precise in her description of events. She said, "The man's hands are tied, and he's been sitting on those steps for close to an hour, and no one has told him why." Her nephew said he would make some calls. Kyle Stearns stood near the bottom of the steps and tried to appear purposeful while doing very little, which is a difficult performance to sustain for 90 minutes, and he was not entirely succeeding. He had taken a bottle of water from his cruiser at the 40-minute mark and set it on the step within Walter's reach without making eye contact or saying anything. It was a gesture in between, not acknowledgement of wrongdoing, not quite indifference, and Walter understood it for what it was, a young man who knew something was wrong and could not yet afford to say so. He did not drink the water, not because he didn't want it, but because accepting anything from Stearns felt like a transaction he wasn't willing to enter. At the 55-minute mark, Cassandra Birch arrived. She was 44 years old, tall and calm, packed in a dark green wool coat, and she carried a cup of coffee from the market stall in one hand and had the unhurried quality of a person who moves through a space exactly as fast as she intends to. She had been at the farmer's market for her regular Sunday trip, purchasing the early strawberries she made jam from in late spring. When she had registered the interaction at the courthouse steps, first peripherally, then with increasing attention, then with the kind of clarity that arrived when she understood what she was looking at. She approached Walter directly, without addressing Pruitt, and crouched at his level. She had a low, precise voice that carried without effort. "Sir, my name is Cassandra Birch. I'm an attorney. You don't have to say anything to anyone. I'm here if you need representation." Walter looked at her. "I appreciate that. I do have an attorney of record, but his specialty isn't criminal law." A pause. "These are zip ties." Cassandra looked at his wrists. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went very still, in a way that people who know her had learned to read as the moment when she shifted from observing to acting. "Yes," she said, "they are." Pruitt was at the cruiser and appeared not to have noticed her yet. Stearns was watching from the bottom of the steps. Cassandra stood and turned to Stearns. "Deputy, what are the formal charges against this gentleman?" Stearns looked at her. "He's detained, not charged." "Under what authority? What's the basis for the detention?" "Officer Pruitt, I'm asking you. You're present. What's the stated basis?" Stearns opened his mouth, closed it. "Resisting an officer. Public disturbance." "Has he been read his rights?" A longer pause. "He's detained." "You said that." Has he been read his rights? Stearns looked toward the cruiser as if hoping Pruitt would appear and take the question. Pruitt had not appeared. Cassandra turned back to Walter. Don't answer any questions without me present. I'll stay. She said this clearly, and at a volume that was appropriate for the steps, and also incidentally for the cameras that were recording from 4 different angles. Pruitt appeared from behind his cruiser and saw Cassandra, and his face changed in a specific way, the kind of change that happens when a man who has been in the comfortable middle of something suddenly perceives that the edges of it have shifted in a direction he didn't authorize. He walked up the steps. Ma'am, you need to step back. Cassandra did not step back. I'm an attorney, and I'm speaking to a detained individual. That's a legal right. If you want to arrest me for it, I'd sincerely like to see that paperwork. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a business card, held it out to him. Cassandra Birch and Associates. Licensed Virginia Bar, number 0423817. Whenever you're ready. Pruitt looked at the card, looked at Cassandra. Did not take the card. You're obstructing. I'm practicing law, Cassandra said. Those are different activities. One of them you can interrupt, the other one you cannot. The door to the courthouse opened, and Rebecca Hollis, the chief clerk of the recorder's office, came down the steps. She was a slight woman in her mid-50s, gray-haired and brisk, and she wore the expression of someone who had come to resolve a scheduling confusion and found herself standing in the middle of something considerably larger. Mr. Moss! She looked at Walter on the steps, at his bound wrists, at the dried blood on his lip. Her face went through several things in rapid succession. I came down when you didn't appear for your appointment. She looked at Pruitt. Officer Mr. Moss has a 10 o'clock appointment in my office. He is a county resident of 34 years, and he has a scheduled administrative hearing. This man is detained, ma'am. On what grounds? Ma'am, please go back inside. Rebecca Hollis did not go back inside. She had been chief clerk for 9 years, and she had a very clear sense of the boundaries of the courthouse's authority and the police department's authority, and where those two things began to overlap in ways that were her professional business. Officer, unless there is paperwork supporting this detention, I'm going to have to ask you to release this gentleman so he can attend a scheduled county appointment. Pruitt looked at Rebecca, at Cassandra, at the crowd that had formed, not large, maybe 20 people now, but present and not dispersing. And for the first time since the plaza that morning, something in his certainty flickered. Not broke, not even cracked exactly, but flickered. He said the appointment can be rescheduled. It was already rescheduled twice. Rebecca said with a patience that had a very clean edge to it. And Mr. Moss is here on time for the confirmed appointment. A pause. I'm going to note in the county record that I came downstairs to inquire about a detained appointee. Just so there's a record. She turned and went back up the steps. She did not look at Pruitt again. Pruitt watched her go. Then he turned and looked at the crowd, at the teenagers, with phones at Maria Gonzalez, not quite arranging flowers at Harriet Coleman, with her own phone at Cassandra Birch, standing 2 feet away with her business card still extended at the black SUV in the far corner of the parking lot that had been there for the past 9 minutes, and which he was only now registering with any particular attention. He looked at Walter. Walter looked back at him. His hands were in his lap, zip ties around his wrists. His hearing aid was in the shadow of the planter. His glasses were on the bricks. His lip had stopped bleeding, but the evidence of it was still there, dried and dark at the corner of his mouth. He was sitting straight the way he had sat straight for an hour, with the kind of postural control that is not stubbornness so much as identity. The specific straightness of a man who has decided in some foundational part of himself that there is no circumstance that will make him fold. Pruitt stepped close to him, close enough that it was supposed to be intimidating. Walter waited. You know what your problem is. Pruitt's voice was low, private, not for the crowd. You think because you pressed your shirt and made your little appointment and came down here with your briefcase, that changes anything. That changes what I see when I look at you. It doesn't. Walter said nothing. You think you're something special. Pruitt looked at the satchel, the scattered documents, the cream paper with the FBI letterhead that was still against the column. He didn't look at it long enough to read it. You're not. You're an old man on some steps, and I'm the law here. That's what this is. Walter looked up at him steady. He said, one thing, officer, I would like my hearing aid, please. Pruitt looked at the hearing aid in the shadow of the planter. He looked at Walter. He looked at the hearing aid again, and then he raised his boot and stepped forward and kicked it off the step. It fell over the edge into the landscaping below, into the mulch and early crocuses, somewhere in the low tangle of dormant shrubs. The sound that came from the crowd was not a gasp exactly. It was the specific exhalation that happens when a group of people witnesses something that crosses a line they hadn't realized they were waiting for. A line they now understood had been there all along. Marcus Webb from the wall said "damn" in a voice that was quiet but audible, and his camera didn't move. Harriet Coleman raised her phone higher. Stearns turned and walked 3 steps down to the bottom of the landing and stood with his back to the scene, and his hand went to his radio, and he did not use it. And this turning away was its own kind of statement, though what kind depended entirely on what he did next, which had not yet been determined. Engagement break. He had the badge. He had the law. He had all the institutional authority available to him in that space. And he used it to kick a hearing aid away from a 71-year-old man who was already sitting in bound hands on cold marble steps. Think about that for a moment. What would you have done standing in that crowd? Would you have stayed? Would you have walked away? Would you have found your voice? Drop your answer in the comments. Stories like this matter most when they start a real conversation. And if this is hitting close to home for you, please hit the like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Walter Moss sat on the steps and looked at the corner of the parking lot where the black SUV was parked, and the SUV had not moved, and Walter breathed and did not look at the landscaping where his hearing aid had gone, because looking at the landscaping would be the same as acknowledging that it was gone and he was not there yet. He was thinking about his father pouring concrete in the summer of 1961. He was thinking about George Moss, who had found men willing to help him after the first contractor walked away, who had built this house with hands already roughened by the textile mill, who had stood in the front yard and told his 12-year-old son, "The house is ours. We built it. Remember that." Walter remembered, and he thought 40 minutes, maybe less now. He was not afraid. He was not defeated. He was a man sitting very still in the middle of something that was almost over in a way that the man standing over him had not yet understood. The SUV in the corner of the parking lot had been there for 11 minutes when its door opened. The relief that arrived with Cassandra was physical. Not the relief of rescue. Walter did not think of what was happening as requiring rescue, but the specific relief of realizing you are not the only clear-eyed person in a room. He had been carrying the full weight of understanding what was happening on these steps for nearly an hour, and the awareness that someone else now understood it too reduced that weight by half in an instant. He thought about Cora. She had always said, "You can't carry the whole thing alone. You were not made to carry the whole thing alone." Walter had spent 50 years gently disputing this, not argumentatively, just by continuing to carry, because that was what the situation required. And Cora had spent 50 years watching him do it, and loving him, and being quietly correct. He thought she would have liked Cassandra Birch. She would have liked everyone out here right now, with their phones and their quiet determination. The teenagers on the wall, and Maria at the flower stall, and Harriet Coleman with her neat, organized purpose. Cora had organized the Millbrook County voter registration drive in 1987 with a folding table and a box of pens and 40 consecutive Saturdays of showing up until the numbers moved. She had believed with a practical and unromantic conviction that Walter had found more sustaining than any grand theory, that what you did on the Saturdays no one watched was what actually changed things. These people were doing the Saturday work. They were staying when they could have left. They were making it their business. Walter straightened his back against the step and thought about Cora and felt in the middle of everything a specific and sustaining gratitude. The man who came out of the SUV was wearing a Georgetown Hoyas t-shirt, dark gray with the bulldog on the chest slightly faded from repeated washing. The kind of faded that happens when a shirt has been worn enough to become comfortable, which is a different kind of worn from worn out. Dark jeans, running shoes in navy and white, a light jacket unzipped. He had his father's height, 6'1", spare-framed, and his mother's eyes, which were the kind of dark brown that could look black in certain light, and which processed information the way a camera processes it, steadily, comprehensively, without sentiment in the initial pass. He would be sentimental later. Not now. Marcus Elijah Moss was 43 years old, and he had been in Millbrook County since Saturday morning down from Washington for a long-planned visit. He had left the house at 8 to drive to a colleague's breakfast meeting 40 miles south, which was why he had not been with his father, which was the one thing about this morning he would carry longest. He had been on the highway, coffee in the cup holder, when his phone had lit up with the text from Walter's number. "Bench outside, don't rush, document everything first." He had read it twice. He had understood it completely. He had understood not just its words, but its architecture, the calm of it, the specific sequence of priorities, the don't rush, which was not reassurance but instruction, and the document everything first, which was not caution but strategy. His father had sent this text because his father had expected to need it, had prepared it in advance, had perhaps composed it while choosing which cufflinks to wear that morning. Marcus had pulled off at the next exit and turned around. He had called his duty officer and given 3 names: Officer Dale Pruitt, Millbrook County, PD, and Deputy Kyle Stearns, and his own name because some information requires context to be useful. And the context here was that the Deputy Director of the FBI's National Security Division was about to walk onto a courthouse plaza in a college t-shirt, and he wanted his people to know where he was. The duty officer had run the names before Marcus was back on the highway. What came back on Pruitt had made Marcus's hands tighten briefly on the wheel. 14 prior complaints, 11 dismissed, 3 involving black male civilians over the age of 60, 1 involving a complaint from a county commissioner's office that had also been dismissed 18 months ago after the commissioner, the first black woman to hold the office in Millbrook County, declined to pursue it, citing confidence in the department's internal process. Marcus had set the phone face down on the passenger seat and driven the remaining 30 miles with the radio off because he knew that music right now would be the wrong thing. And silence right now was the useful thing, because silence let him think, and thinking was what this required. He had arrived at the courthouse parking lot 14 minutes ago. He had pulled into the far corner, engine off, and studied the scene through the windshield with the specific professional patience that is not coldness but preparation. The practiced assessment of an environment before entering it. Understanding vectors and positions and the placement of witnesses and the emotional temperature of a crowd before you become part of it. He had seen his father on the steps. He had seen the zip ties. He had seen the blood at the corner of Walter's mouth. He had breathed once the specific kind of breath that is a recalibration rather than a sigh, and he had waited, not because he needed time to prepare. He had prepared before he arrived. He waited because his father's text had said don't rush, and because rushing into a scene with a man like Pruitt before the witness documentation was fully established would be tactically suboptimal in a way that Walter, who had sent the text, would have recognized. His father was buying time by sitting still. Marcus was honoring that by doing the same. He had watched Marcus Webb filming from the wall. He had seen Maria Gonzalez at the flower stall and the angle of the phone and understood immediately. He had seen Harriet Coleman. He had seen the attorney. He would learn her name shortly, who had positioned herself with the precision of someone who knew what they were doing. He had seen Rebecca Hollis come down from the recorder's office and return. He had seen Stearns turn his back and stand at the base of the steps. And then he had seen Pruitt kick the hearing aid, and the specific thing that happened to the crowd in that moment. Not anger, not quite, but something that consolidated the way a liquid consolidates into something more solid when the temperature drops, and he had understood that the documentation was as complete as it was going to get and that it was time. He stepped out of the SUV and walked across the parking lot. He moved at the pace of a man who is neither hurrying nor dawdling, which is its own statement about who has the advantage in a situation. Unhurried is authority. Unhurried is, I have already decided how this ends. He had learned this from watching his father walk into rooms for 43 years, the specific cadence of a man who carries his legitimacy with him, like a coat worn so naturally that it is no longer separate from the body. He stopped at the edge of the farmer's market. Maria Gonzalez was the closest person to him, and he spoke to her briefly, his voice low. How long has he been on those steps? Maria looked at him. About an hour and 15 minutes. A pause. I have it on video. All of it. Thank you. He looked at the steps, then he walked to the bottom of the landscaping strip and crouched and looked in the mulch until he found the hearing aid. It was between two plantings of English ivy, beige and small. The thin curve of it almost invisible, and he picked it up and held it carefully in his palm. He walked to the steps. He did not look at Pruitt yet. He walked past Stearns, who said nothing, and went to his father and crouched in front of him. Walter looked at him. Nothing in his father's face was collapsed or diminished, which was both what Marcus had hoped for and what had broken something in his chest when he'd seen it through the windshield. His father had not fallen apart. His father had not fallen apart because his father did not fall apart, and the combination of pride in that and grief about the fact that it had been necessary again still always was something Marcus would process at another time. He held out his hand with the hearing aid. Walter took it and placed it in his right ear, and the cotton muffle resolved back into the world's full texture, and Walter blinked once and said quietly, "You're wearing your old shirt." "I was at breakfast," Marcus said. Walter made a very small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "You drove 40 miles in that shirt." "I drove 40 miles in this shirt." Marcus looked at the zip ties. He looked at his father's lip. He breathed. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "My hip, from sitting." "Nothing new." Walter paused. The hearing aid was in the landscaping. "I know. I found it." They looked at each other for one more moment, and in that moment, there was an entire conversation that did not require words about the text message sent in advance, about the 40-minute wait, about the 43 years before that, about the house on Sycamore Road and the foundation poured in 1961, and the cufflinks with the letter M and the voice memo running in the breast pocket, and every careful, strategic, exhausting, necessary thing that had led to this bench on these steps on this Sunday morning. Then Marcus stood. He turned around. Pruitt was there 4 feet away with the expression of a man who has been watching a situation assemble itself and has not quite understood what it is assembling into. "Step back. This man is detained." Marcus looked at him. Just looked at him for a moment, the way you look at something you are assessing rather than reacting to. "What are the charges?" His voice was conversational, not loud, not aggressive. The kind of voice that doesn't need amplification because it has an underlying frequency that carries on its own. Pruitt's eyes moved over Marcus, the t-shirt, the jeans, the running shoes, and performed the familiar calculation, which was the same calculation he had performed when he looked at Walter that morning, and arrived at the same answer, which was the same answer he always arrived at with this specific calculation, which was not a person I need to take seriously. "Who are you?" "His lawyer." "Number." "Then step back." Marcus did not step back. A beat. 2 beats. The crowd was very quiet now. The farmers' market behind them had stilled. Harriet Coleman, who had been recording since the hearing aid, had not lowered her phone. Pruitt stepped forward. His hand moved toward his belt. Not to his weapon, he had not gone there. But the gesture of it, the reach toward the belt, was a language everyone present understood. "On your knees," Pruitt said. Cassandra Birch, standing 6 feet away, held very still. Marcus kept his eyes on Pruitt. He said, "Officer, I'm going to reach into my back pocket and hand you something. I'm telling you in advance so there's no confusion." "I decide what you hand me." "Understood. But I'm going to hand it to you regardless, so I wanted you to know in advance that my hand is going to move. I'm telling you exactly what it's going to do before it does it." He paused 1 beat. "So that there is no confusion." The pause after that sentence lasted approximately 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, the plaza was so quiet that you could hear distinctly the canvas of the flower stall shifting in the light breeze, and the murmur of the market 2 rows away, and the click of Marcus Webb's phone recording, and the specific quality of 30 people simultaneously holding their breath. Marcus reached into his back pocket. He moved slowly, smoothly, with a precision that was in itself a message. The message being, "I have done this before I know exactly how to do it. I am choosing to do it this way." He produced a flat leather credentials wallet, black federal grade, the kind that folds and holds a badge on one side and an ID card on the other. He flipped it open. He held it at Pruitt's eye level, close enough to read without squinting, steady, unhurried. The badge was gold, deep gold. Not the decorative gold of a costume or a novelty item, but the specific dense gold of a federal shield that has weight to it The eagle at the top, with wings spread over the circular face, the blue enamel of the seal. The engraved text. In the sunlight, it threw a small, bright reflection across the front of Pruitt's uniform. The holographic watermark was visible on the ID card behind it, an iridescent stripe across the photo that shifted from blue to gold as the angle changed. The photo showed Marcus in a dark suit expression, the same as the expression he was wearing right now, because it was always the same expression, because this expression was not posed. It was simply what his face did when he was paying attention. The text on the credentials read, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Marcus Elijah Mies Moss, Deputy Director, National Security Division. Pruitt read it. He read it again. The color left his face in a specific sequence, first from his jaw, then from his cheeks, then from his forehead, moving upward the way water leaves a glass when you set it sideways, not all at once, but in a continuous smooth recession. His skin took on the quality of something that has been underneath something else for a long time, pet in a way that had nothing to do with light. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand dropped from his belt. The silence from the crowd lasted approximately 5 seconds, and then broke, not with a shout, but with a wavy of sound that was people exhaling and speaking simultaneously. A rush that moved outward from the steps like a ripple. A woman to the left said, "Oh my God!" And the sound carried. Someone else from near the vegetable stand said something that was lost in the noise, but whose tone was unmistakable, the specific satisfaction of watching something inevitable finally arrive. Stearns at the bottom of the steps had turned around. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting for the specific shape of a consequence and has now seen it and finds it exactly the size he was afraid it would be. Marcus closed the credentials wallet. He put it back in his pocket. He let the silence breathe for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "Remove the zip ties from my father. Do it carefully." Engagement break. He had called himself the law. He had said, "I'm the one who decides what you need. I'm the one who determines what this is." And then a man in a college t-shirt reached into his back pocket, and the law turned out to be something else entirely. How many people like Walter Moss have faced what he faced without a deputy director walking across the parking lot? Without the cameras, without the attorney, without anyone? That question deserves an answer, and the answer starts with conversations like this one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe our channel. We find these stories and we tell them because they matter, because the people in them matter, and because you deserve to know them. Pruitt's hands shook when he cut the zip ties. He used a small folding knife from his belt, which was the standard issue, and it took him 3 attempts to get the blade positioned correctly, because his hands would not entirely cooperate, and the crowd watched this in silence. Every phone angled toward the steps, every pair of eyes tracking the specific quality of a man's hands when the certainty has gone out of them and what's left is just biology, muscle, and nerve with nothing to direct them. The plastic gave. Walter's wrists came free. Walter sat for a moment rubbing the skin where the ties had been. The marks were visible red lines, slightly raised. He rubbed them methodically, the way you restore circulation to a part of your body that has been constrained with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who is dealing with the physical reality of a situation, rather than its emotional architecture. Because the emotional architecture could wait because he was very practiced at making things wait. Marcus set his hand on his father's shoulder. "Can you stand?" "Yes." Walter stood. His hip shifted under him, and Marcus steadied him with a hand under his elbow, and Walter stood straight full height, and whatever the previous 90 minutes had tried to do to his posture had not succeeded, because Walter Moss stood straight, the way his father had stood straight, which was the way his grandfather had stood straight, which was a tradition passed down through the Moss family, like the cufflinks with the letter M, not without cost, but without negotiation. He retrieved his glasses from the bricks. One lens had a small chip at the lower corner. He put them on, looked around the plaza, and saw it clearly. For the first time since the slap, the crowd, the phones, the teenagers on the wall. Maria Gonzalez, with her hand pressed to her mouth, Harriet Coleman, still recording Cassandra Birch, standing with the specific stillness of someone who has just watched something she has been waiting to see for a long time. Cassandra moved toward Marcus. I'm Cassandra Birch. I've been here since the detention began. I have contact information for 11 witnesses and my own documentation from arrival. She paused. I'd also like to flag that the zip tie usage was non-standard. Standard procedure requires handcuffs for detention, which allows for double locking and documentation. Zip ties have no formal logging mechanism. Marcus looked at her. You're good. I'm thorough, Cassandra said. There's a difference. Marcus nodded. He looked at his father. He looked at the cream paper with the FBI letterhead still against the column. He'd seen it when he walked up the same paper, the same embossed seal. And he crossed to it and picked it up and held it for a moment. It was the commendation letter from the director sent to Walter Moss Sr. in acknowledgement of his community contributions to the county, something Marcus had arranged 18 months ago as a surprise for his father's birthday, which Walter had evidently decided to bring today in his satchel, because Walter brought everything that was relevant to everything. Marcus put the letter in his breast pocket. He made one call. He said 3 words, Millbrook County. Now. He ended the call and put his phone away and turned back to the scene with the expression he wore during briefings, not cold, not warm, processing. Pruitt was still standing on the steps. He had not moved. He had the quality of a man who has gone very still in the way that animals go still, when they understand that stillness is their only remaining strategy. He was not running. He was not speaking. He was waiting for whatever was coming in the way that people wait for things that they understand are now beyond their capacity to redirect. Stearns had moved to the side of the steps and was on his phone, speaking quietly and faintly, and quickly. Marcus glanced at him and made a decision that the details of that call could be established later, because there would be time for all of it to be established. The FBI field agents arrived 12 minutes later. 2 of them in a dark sedan, tactical vests over their shirts, federal identification out before they reached the steps. They had come from the field office in Richmond, and they had pushed the speed limit, and they had been briefed on the drive by the duty officer that Marcus had called while turning around on the highway. They were not visibly agitated. Federal agents of a certain experience have learned to enter scenes at the temperature required to reduce them rather than the temperature imposed by the scenes themselves. The taller one was a woman, Agent Denise Farrow, who had been in the Civil Rights Division for 8 years before transferring to Field Ops. She came to Marcus, directly spoke briefly, received the summary that Marcus had organized in his head on the drive down, and which came out in perhaps 45 seconds, clean and precise, without editorializing. The shorter one, Agent Robert Cage, went to Walter and crouched and spoke to him at eye level, which was a specific choice, and asked him to describe the morning's events in his own words, and produced a small voice recorder and listened. Pruitt stood on the steps and was informed that he was the subject of a federal inquiry under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. He was informed of this by Agent Farrow, who said it in the same tone she might use to describe a traffic pattern, because tone here was as important as content, and the content was already severe enough on its own. Marcus Webb came forward. He was 17 years old, and he had the kind of self-possession that is assembled from necessity rather than privilege, and he walked up to Marcus Moss with his phone in his hand and 67 minutes of footage in its memory, and said, "I have it all. The whole thing. From before he even sat down, because I saw the cop watching him from across the plaza, and I thought." He stopped. "I just thought I should start filming." Marcus looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding how to express something accurately. "What's your name?" "Marcus Webb." A pause. "Good instinct, Marcus." He extended his hand. Marcus Webb shook it. He was in a way that he would understand better when he was older, shaking the hand of the reason his instinct had mattered. Maria Gonzalez came forward with her phone. Her cousin from the vegetable stand had already emailed his stall camera's cloud storage access to the duty officer. Because the duty officer had asked, and he had provided. Because the duty officer had explained what it was for. Harriet Coleman provided her 42 minutes of audio recording and 9 minutes of video, along with the names and phone numbers of 6 other witnesses she had collected during the hour she had spent in this plaza, because Harriet Coleman was a retired social studies teacher, and her instinct was to document, organize, and preserve, which was an instinct that served the exact purposes it needed to serve on this Sunday morning. Rebecca Hollis came back downstairs with Walter's appointment documentation. and the county's scheduled calendar for the morning, and a statement which she had already written, printed and signed on county letterhead, describing her interaction with Officer Pruitt and his refusal to facilitate a confirmed county appointment. Cassandra Birch produced her own written notes, timestamped with witness contact information organized alphabetically. The evidence was by any reasonable measure extraordinary. The Millbrook County Police Chief arrived at the courthouse at 11:47. His name was Gerald Fenton, and he was red-faced in the specific way of men who have been receiving urgent calls for the past 20 minutes and who have been driving fast in a car that felt too small, and his tie was slightly askew, and there was a quality about him of a man running to catch up to something that was moving faster than he was. He reached the base of the steps, took in the scene, the FBI agents, the crowd, the evidence gathering, Pruitt standing on the steps in the particular stillness of a man who had run out of posture, and he went to Marcus. Marcus did not offer pleasantries. Your officer struck a detained civilian, kicked a medical device away from him, and left him zip-tied on public steps for 90 minutes without formal charges, paperwork, or advisement of rights. We have continuous documentation of the entire period. Chief Fenton looked at Pruitt. Then he looked back at Marcus. Your Deputy Director Moss, yes. A pause. Fenton said something too quietly to be heard by the crowd. Marcus responded. Fenton made a call. Spoke for 40 seconds. His face did several things in sequence. He walked up the steps to Pruitt. The conversation lasted 93 seconds. Pruitt said something. Fenton said something. Pruitt said something again. Fenton held up a hand, and the finality in the gesture had a very clear grammar. There was no more conversation to be had on this particular topic. Officer Pruitt, Fenton said, and this part was audible because Fenton had allowed it to be audible. You are terminated from service with the Millbrook County Police Department, effective immediately pending formal review. You are to surrender your badge and service weapon to Agent Farrow. The sound from the crowd was specific and unmistakable. It was not a cheer. It was something more involuntary than a cheer, the sound of pressure releasing from a container. The particular exhalation that happens when something that has needed to be said for a very long time is finally said. And the relief of it is physical and immediate and moves through a group of people simultaneously. And Harriet Coleman let out a breath she had been holding since she walked to the edge of this plaza 90 minutes ago and saw Walter Moss with his hands bound on the courthouse steps. Engagement break. He had stood on those steps for 90 minutes with the law behind him and the crowd in front of him and every institutional structure telling him he was untouchable. And then a Sunday morning became the worst day of his professional life. Justice doesn't always announce itself in advance. Sometimes it drives 40 miles in a Georgetown t-shirt and finds a hearing aid in the landscaping first. If this story made you feel something, if you've ever been where Walter was or watched someone you love be where Walter was, please leave a comment. We read every one of them, and subscribe our channel so you never miss these stories because there are more of them and they all deserve to be heard. Walter Moss and Cassandra Birch and Rebecca Hollis went upstairs. The appointment took 22 minutes. Walter spread his documents on the clerk's table with the same methodical precision he had used to prepare them. Deed, title, insurance, payoff, letter payment, history, photographs, assessor's records, certified letter, return receipt, and Rebecca Hollis reviewed them with the focused efficiency of a chief clerk who has seen excellent documentation and recognizes it on site. The improper lien was flagged for administrative hold pending full investigation of its origins. Walter received a stamped acknowledgement of contest, a case number, and a written confirmation that the lien was under county review and could not be enforced pending outcome. He sat across the table and watched the clerk press the stamp, and he held the copy in his hands, and the weight of it was the weight of the deed his father had signed in 1983, and the weight of every property tax receipt in his accordion file, and the weight of 34 years of weekday mornings walking out the front door of the house on Sycamore Road to a world that had been trying with varying degrees of effort and sophistication to make him feel like a guest in his own life. It had not worked. He stood up, thanked Rebecca Hollis, and shook her hand. He collected his documents, except for the two that Stearns had carelessly deposited upside down in his satchel, which he reorganized and refiled in their correct sections. He buckled the satchel. He descended the stairs. He found Marcus waiting at the bottom, leaning against the railing, still in the Georgetown shirt. How'd it go? Lien is flagged. Under review. He held up the stamped paper. Marcus took it, read it, handed it back. Good. He looked at his father. You want to get lunch? Walter looked at the courthouse plaza, which was still busy with the aftermath of the morning agent's witnesses' paperwork, the specific organized chaos of a federal inquiry beginning to unfold. He looked at the sun, which had moved while he was indoors and was now genuinely warm. He looked at the farmers' market, which had continued operating as farmers' markets do, because the world's practical needs don't pause for its moral crises. I want the strawberries first, he said. The early ones. Marcus looked at him. Then he laughed. It was a full laugh, sudden and genuine, and Walter watched it happen and thought about a 9-year-old boy at a kitchen table with homework, and thought about the word navigate, and thought about how his son had grown into a man who did not go around, who had driven 40 miles to be here, who had found a hearing aid in the landscaping before he did anything else. I know where to get them, Marcus said. They walked toward the farmer's market together, the son adjusting his pace to his father's, the satchel at Walter's side, the commendation letter in Marcus's breast pocket, and the stamped lien contest in Walter's hand, and the sun warm on both of them, and the morning changed. What followed had this quality of a stone dropped in. In still water, the initial impact was visible and immediate, but the rings that spread outward moved further and touched more things than the original moment could have predicted. Dale Pruitt was formally charged with assault and battery under Virginia state law, deprivation of rights under color of law pursuant to 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and falsification of detention records, the last charge arising from the discovery that he had filed a brief incident notation, time-stamped before Agent Farrow arrived, that described the situation as voluntary compliance by civilian after initial resistance incident, resolved without escalation. This document, written while Walter Moss was sitting zip-tied on the courthouse steps with blood on his lip, was itself sufficient for the falsification charge and was the piece of evidence that most clearly demonstrated the consciousness of guilt that prosecutors would later cite extensively in pre-trial motions. He was released on bond and attended 4 arraignments over the next 6 months. At the first one, he appeared with a private attorney. At the 4th, he appeared with a public defender. The private attorney, it was reported, had withdrawn after the full video evidence was made available in discovery, which was a decision that required very little explanation. Pruitt faced up to 8 years on the federal charge alone. In the end, after plea negotiations, he accepted a deal: 4 years in federal prison, 2 years supervised release mandatory participation in a law enforcement accountability program as a condition of release, and a lifetime ban from serving in any law enforcement capacity in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The ban was the thing Pruitt's original attorney had pushed hardest against, and it was the thing that prosecutors had held firmest, because everyone understood that the ban was not punishment. The ban was protection. Kyle Stearns was suspended without pay pending investigation. He spent 8 weeks on suspension and came back to the department under a formal improvement plan and a requirement to submit to quarterly review for 2 years. He also testified at Pruitt's preliminary hearing, and his testimony was notable for 2 things: its specificity. He remembered details that many witnesses forget, which suggested he had spent considerable time with them, and the single moment when he said without prompting that when Pruitt kicked Walter's hearing aid into the landscape, "I knew I should have said something, and I didn't, and I have to carry that." His union representative sitting beside him did not comment on this. The FBI's formal investigation of Millbrook County PD's complaint records was completed within 4 months. The findings were significant. Of the 847 complaint records reviewed, 43% involved black civilians as complainants in a county where black residents comprised 19% of the population. 11 complaints involving black male civilians over the age of 55 had been dismissed at the supervisory review level without any contact with the complainant, meaning the person who filed the complaint was never called, never interviewed, never told what had happened to their complaint. It had simply disappeared. 3 of those complaints involved Officer Dale Pruitt. One involved a man named Arthur Gaines, 72, a retired postal worker who had filed a complaint 4 years ago describing an interaction on his own front porch that had left him with bruised ribs. His complaint had been dismissed. He had been told in a letter that the department had reviewed the matter and found no evidence of misconduct. He had kept the letter in a file folder in his kitchen for 4 years, and when the FBI investigator called him, he said, "I've been waiting for somebody to call." Marcus testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee 6 weeks after the Millbrook incident. He appeared in his suit blue tie, the credentials in his breast pocket, and he spoke for 40 minutes about the gap between documented complaint rates and complaint review rates in county law enforcement departments, about the absence of mandatory external review mechanisms, about the specific vulnerability of elderly civilians who are less likely to have legal resources and more likely to internalize the message that their complaints will go nowhere. He cited Millbrook County extensively. He cited Arthur Gaines specifically with permission. 3 senators asked him follow-up questions. One asked whether he believed federal oversight of county law enforcement was constitutional. He said the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause was passed in 1868 specifically to address the failure of state and local entities to protect black citizens. The question of whether federal oversight of local law enforcement is constitutional is not uncertain. The question is whether we're willing to use the authority we already have. The Senate gallery was quiet for a moment after that. Walter Moss was watching on the television in the living room of the house on Sycamore Road. He was in his chair, the one near the window, with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold, and which he had not noticed going cold because he had been watching his son. His grandson, Deshaun, 12 years old, was asleep on the couch with his sneakers still on, having stayed up late enough to see the opening of the testimony before falling asleep because Deshaun had wanted to see Uncle Marcus do the thing and had held out as long as 12 years old allowed. Walter watched his son on the screen and thought about the house and the foundation and the cufflinks and the morning in the courthouse plaza and the stamped paper that was now in his filing cabinet with the deed and the title insurance and the payment history, all of it in its correct plow, all of it documented. He thought about Cora, who had always said Marcus reminded her of Walter's father, not in face or frame, but in the quality of his attention, the way he sat with a problem until he understood all its dimensions before he moved. She had said, "He got your patience and my temper, but he learned to use both of them at the right time." She had been right, as Cora generally was about things. He thought about Arthur Gaines, 72, with a file folder in his kitchen, 4 years of waiting. He thought about Amos Jefferson, who had sold his house $60,000 under market because the walls had felt like they were closing in. He thought about Dorothy Watkins, who had won and what it had cost her to win. He thought about Sycamore Road in the morning, the way light came through the kitchen window at a specific angle in late spring, touching the counter where Cora's coffee timer still ran, and how the house smelled of cedar and old wood and the particular permanence of a place that has been inhabited for generations and knows what it is. The improper lien on 114 Sycamore Road was fully discharged 5 weeks after the administrative hearing. The county's investigation of Whitmore Development and Construction, LLC, found that the lien had been one of 7 filed in the past 2 years against properties in the county's East Side redevelopment zone. Of the 7 lien holders, 5 were black homeowners over the age of 60. 2 had sold, 1 had settled. Walters was the only one that had proceeded to a formal administrative contest. The state attorney general's office alerted to the Whitmore pattern by Marcus's field agents during the broader Millbrook investigation opened a separate inquiry. It would take 14 months to complete. Whitmore's principal, a developer named Bradley Whitmore, who had 3 county commissioner contacts and no history of consequences, entered a consent agreement that required him to pay restitution to the 5 affected homeowners, clear all 7 fraudulent liens from the title records, and post a $200,000 compliance bond against future filings. The 2 homeowners who had sold one of them, Amos Jefferson, were not made whole by the restitution because you cannot fully compensate a man for the house his family built, and no bond covers what is lost when the walls close in before you have a chance to fight. But it was something. It was the acknowledgement that what had happened was real, had a name, had a perpetrator, and had consequences. Marcus Webb's 67 minutes of footage was viewed 4.1 million times in the 3 weeks after the incident became public. He was interviewed for a segment on a national news magazine program, during which he explained that he had learned to film because his mother had told him when he was 12 that documentation was survival and that he should never be the only person who knew what had happened to him. He was asked what he wanted to be. He said, "I'm thinking law, or maybe journalism, something where what I saw matters." The program's producer, watching the interview in post, made a note to herself that the kid had real presence. She would reach out the following month about an internship. Harriet Coleman's name appeared in the investigative report as a key witness, and she was quoted in 2 newspaper articles about the case. She told one reporter, "We don't stay quiet anymore. That's the thing that's changed. We don't stay quiet." Cassandra Birch filed a civil suit on Walter's behalf against the county and against Pruitt personally. The county settled before the year was out, a settlement whose terms were confidential, but whose size was by several accounts sufficient to indicate that the county's legal counsel had reviewed the evidence and made a very rapid assessment about the trajectory of any trial. Cassandra donated her fee to the Millbrook County Legal Aid Society. The county also, at the recommendation of Chief Fenton, who had arrived late to the morning's events and understood that arriving late and then acting correctly was not the same as having prevented them, and was attempting to demonstrate this understanding through action rather than statement, implemented a mandatory external review process for all use of force incidents involving civilians over the age of 60. The process required review by a 3-person panel that included 1 member independent of the department. It was not enough, but it was more than there had been the week before. Walter Moss returned to the county community board meeting 2 weeks after the courthouse incident. He attended as he always had as a resident who brought his accounting expertise to the review of departmental budgets and asset forfeiture reports, because Walter Moss understood that the most durable form of oversight was the kind that showed up every 3rd Thursday and made sure the numbers were honest. He sat in his usual seat, 3rd row from the left, with his notepad and his reading glasses and the same quiet, methodical attention he had brought to every meeting for the past 9 years. 3 people stopped him before the meeting began to shake his hand. One of them was Arthur Gaines. "I heard they called you," Walter said. "They called me." Arthur paused. "Took 4 years. I know." Arthur Gaines looked at him, "But they called." Walter nodded. They sat together for the meeting, these 2 men in their 70s, with their good shoes and their careful posture and their long memories. And they listened to the county's department budget presentation, and they asked the specific questions that the budget needed to be asked. That is what accountability looks like much of the time. Not the dramatic reversal, not the single moment of public consequence, not the gold badge held up in the sunlight. It looks like 2 men in their 70s in the 3rd row on a Thursday night, asking where the money went and not leaving until the answer makes sense. On a Tuesday evening in early summer, Walter was on his porch with coffee when Marcus called. "Checking in," Marcus said. "Everything is fine," Walter said. "The strawberries were good this year." A pause. "I know I was there." "I know you were there." "I'm reminding you." A pause. "Your grandmother would have liked them. She always said early strawberries had more flavor than the late ones." "I know. You told me that." "I'll keep telling you." Marcus laughed. "How's the hip?" "Complaining as always." Walter looked at the yard. The lawn needed mowing. He would do it Saturday. His father had paid a 12-year-old boy $2 a week to mow this lawn, and the boy had grown up and mowed it for free for 30 years after that. And now Walter paid his grandson the same $2 because the amount mattered less than the ritual. "Dad," Marcus said. "Yes." "The text you sent. From the bench." Walter waited. "You sent it before you even sat down. You were already on the phone when I called back." "I know." "You prepared it in advance." "I prepared a lot of things in advance. That's how I do things." Another pause longer. "That's how you've always done things." "Yes," Walter said. They were quiet for a moment, the phone line between Washington and Millbrook County, carrying the kind of silence that is the opposite of empty, the kind that contains things that are too complete to fit inside sentences. Then Walter said, "Marcus, the house is ours. We built it. Remember that." He heard his son breathe. "I remember," Marcus said. The evening light came through the trees and fell across the porch, and the yard smelled of cut grass from the neighbor's lawn and the early jasmine that grew along the fence which had been planted by Cora in the spring of their second year in this house, and which came back every year patient and certain the way things come back when they are rooted. Walter Moss sat on his porch and finished his coffee and thought about his father's hands. He thought about what it means to build something and to hold it and to pass it forward. He thought about a 9-year-old boy who said, "I don't want to go around," and a 43-year-old man who drove 40 miles in a Georgetown shirt and found a hearing aid in the landscaping before he did anything else. He thought about Arthur Gaines saying, "But they called." He thought, yes, they called. And we will keep making them call. We will keep showing up. We will keep it being the third row in the third Thursday, and the voice memo running in the breast pocket, and the documents organized and ready, and the cufflinks with the letter M pressed into a son's palm on a morning that requires both of them to be exactly who they are. That is what it means to build a house that holds. If this story moved you, if you've been in a Walter Moss moment, if you've been the crowd that watched, if you're the Marcus Webb who decided to film, if you're the Harriet Coleman who collected the names, please leave a comment. Your story belongs in this conversation. Like this video, if you believe that documentation is dignity, that patience is power, and that showing up matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe our channel, because there are more of these stories and they deserve an audience and you deserve to know them. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. The fact that you stayed means something. It means these stories matter to you, which means the people in them matter to you, which is exactly what they need. We're grateful for every one of you. See you in the next one.